Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, the first in a series of 4, which we will review. It's wonderful to have you here today. Matt Lee will be starting to present, and Darren Green will also be presenting with him, and they will do introductions here just in a moment. We also have with us Francis Waite from the South Carolina Forestry Commission, who has generously sponsored this workshop along with funds from the U.S. Forest Service. So with that, I'm going to make Matt Lee the presenter, and as we get into the presentation, we will discuss some of the rules of the pool for how you can comment or ask questions during the presentation.
Let's see. Why is that not showing up? Sorry, for some reason the presentation is not showing up on here. So let me cancel that and do share screen. There we go. All right. Can you see that now?
Yes, I can.
Great.
All right, so I will kick us off. So you are here today to attend the webinar, Help Communities Plan Better for Natural Disasters. And as we said, this is first in a series of 4 webinars. Each webinar is intended to last in total no more than an hour, and we've left some room at the end for questions and discussion. So today we're going to be focusing on tree risk assessment. All right, so all attendees are muted during the live webinar. But if you have a question, you can simply go up to the question panel at any time during the webinar and type in your question. If it's a question that I can answer or one of the other presenters can answer during the presentation, then we'll go ahead and answer that immediately. If it's something that requires a longer discussion, we might leave that question answering till the end and let our speakers tackle that. That red arrow down below shows you just exactly where you can find that question panel where you can type in your question. If you prefer to ask your question live with your own voice instead of typing, we'll also have that opportunity at the end. You can use the raised hand feature down there on the bottom left of your screen, and I will recognize you and unmute you one by one so you can ask your question live. But we will take those at the end of the webinar. We will share recording after the webinar, so if you want to listen to this again and again or share it with your colleagues, you'll be able to do that. It will be posted on a YouTube channel. We will also be sharing a copy of the slide deck. So all of the slides we're presenting today will be shared with you as an Adobe PDF file that you can watch again and again. The only caveat I want to make you aware of is that in order to receive ISA CEUs or the certification maintenance credits provided by APA, we're only making those available during the live presentation, so you can't watch this later and then also get credits. So just to be clear, that part requires live participation throughout the duration of the webinar. All right, next slide. Again, we want to thank our sponsors for this workshop. So we are the Green Infrastructure Center. We are a nonprofit organization, and we partner with key funders to help support this work. We could not do it without the essential funding of the USDA Forest Service, who provided the funds for these education and training materials, and to the thanks to the South Carolina Forestry Commission, the co-sponsors of this workshop. And most especially thanks to Darren Green for bringing his invaluable boots on the ground knowledge. So with that, go to the next slide. All right. As I noted, this is the first in a series of 4 webinars. This today is tree risk assessment. The next webinar will be standing contracts, and that will be on February 20th. Debris management sites will be on March 19th. We're trying to do these all at the same time to make it easy to remember. And then post-storm urban forest recovery, which is something a lot of times people don't talk about, that after the storm, how do we bring our community back? And I think at this point, Darren, you also wanted to add a few words here.
Yeah, just just keep in mind that this is one of a series, and really to get the most benefit, you should plan to attend all of them.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're not going to cover all the important topics in one webinar. We're really going to parse them out. And we also know that no one wants to sit through a 4-hour webinar. So we've tried to dole these out 1 month at a time, give you time to digest all the materials. All right, next slide. Okay, so the Green Infrastructure Center, as I said, is a nonprofit organization. That's my picture on the left. Below me is Matthew Lee. He is the Director of Forest Conservation at the Green Infrastructure Center. And then Darren Green below, who is a landscape architect, and he works for the city of Alexandria, Louisiana. So our nonprofit, the Green Infrastructure Center, helps communities evaluate their green assets and manage them for ecology, economy, and protecting culture. So we do a lot of mapping of urban land cover and tree canopy. We also model high value wildland habitats, so wildlife cores and corridors. We create strategic plans for green infrastructure. We did one for the entire state of South Carolina, but we also create strategies for counties, cities, and towns. And then we, of course, write, train, and teach. So this is part of that mission. And then, Darren, would you like to say a little bit more about Alexandria, Louisiana?
So we are what I would consider a typical southern town. We're about 45,000 people, 29 square miles, which means that we are very spread out, very, I guess, rural population with kind of a dense city center. And we have had our share of storms in the last, even though we are 120 miles from the coast, we still do get a lot of storms.
Yes, and Darren will be also providing his, as we say, boots on the ground knowledge. So he's got a lot of the practical everyday experience. And I'm sure for those of you on the call who are work for a municipality, or if you're a consulting arborist, you'll find a lot of similarities in some of the trials and tribulations that Darren's experienced trying to manage a southern city in the face of all of these storms and disturbances. So with that, we'll launch into the main presentation. So the Green Infrastructure Center has a series of publications that we also produce. So if you're interested in learning more, please do check out our website. We have a lot of these materials available for free download. Even just simple brochures. Are you ready for a major storm? We have other manuals on storm planning, but also about green infrastructure, connecting your landscape, and also urban tree canopy and planting campaigns. So lots of good resources there.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Well, for today's webinar, we're going to specifically be talking about tree risk assessment. We're going to start off by kind of making the case for why this type of work is needed in our modern age. So talking a little bit about some of the trends and why bother doing this type of planning work. And then talk a little bit about what storm readiness means if you're not familiar with that terminology. And then we'll dive right into kind of tree risk assessment, what it is, why is it important, and we'll talk about different case examples in other southern cities. And of course, Darren's going to bring his knowledge and expertise from Alexandria, Louisiana. And then we'll talk also about a little bit other resources that are out there, such as Urban Forest Strike Team and a lot of free online resources and tools. So we've done a lot of the research and identified some of the great resources that are available and free online that you can have access to, and we'll share that. And then, of course, we'll make space at the end of the webinar for a Q&A period. So what are the trends going on with storms? So the NOAA, or the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, has some really great data. There's a link here where you can access a mapping portal where you can find out more information, such as the number of events a particular state is experiencing, both from a storm disasters per year, but they also have other types of natural disasters such as wildfire, flooding, ice storms. So it's a really great data portal to understand kind of what the impacts are going on for your particular state. It's all aggregated at a state level. But from their statistics and data, they have identified that there's about 6 times more billion-dollar severe storm events during the last 20 years than compared to the prior 2 decades from 1980 to 2000. So with their data, they're really seeing a lot more of these events happening, which again makes the case for why we should be doing more storm planning work in our communities. But also the average cost of these events have rose dramatically from 1980 to 2000 to the last 20 years, from 2.5 billion to about $15 billion. So the average cost of these events have also been increasing as well. So we're getting them more frequently, and they're also costing more on average. And that has a lot of different factors that come to play. As we look towards the future, the research is also indicating that these events are also going to tend to get worse. So rainfall rates are likely to increase under models that have been done under a 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario about storm impacts and the rainfall rates within 100 kilometers. So we're going to see a lot more precipitation, and greater precipitation obviously leads to issues like flooding, but the greater precipitation also can exacerbate high wind events during these storms by making it more likely for trees to fail, by saturating the soils, which then increases the lubrication between the roots and the soil particles, causing trees to tend to tip over during high wind events. The storm intensity is also going to increase globally by 1 to 10% under that 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario. And this implies an increase in the destructive potential per storm, assuming no reduction in the size of the storm overall. So why plan? Well, this type of planning work can help you reduce overall tree canopy cover loss. So trees are green infrastructure. They provide numerous ecosystem service benefits to our communities, mitigating stormwater, reducing urban heat island impacts, improving air quality. And so whatever we can do to preserve or conserve this resource or asset that municipalities have is going to be able to increase or mitigate some of these other hazards that we deal with that are not necessarily a storm event. This type of planning work can also help improve local, state, and federal information sharing, especially during a storm response. It can help coordinate these storm response plans. So there's consensus around what's going to happen when a municipality is responding to a particular event and where information or documents are located. It helps identify capacity and areas of need, so identifying where there may be gaps or areas under-resourced and potentially help to mitigate those in advance of the storm. It also helps cities think about what these critical infrastructures are that need to be protected or mitigated. So potentially for this topic, assessing or mitigating risk around city infrastructure, especially the critical infrastructure that you need to do a timely response for a storm. It can also help you get reimbursed for the debris removal and monitoring costs and replacement for lost or damaged trees during a federal major disaster declaration. So you don't want to leave any money on the table or have FEMA deny you for any of your costs for the cleanup efforts because you are not following proper protocols or procedures. So why plan? The price of being unprepared can be enormous. Between 2000 and 2010, FEMA and local governments spent more than $8 billion in disaster-generated debris removal costs. FEMA also estimated the debris removal operations account for approximately 27% of disaster recovery costs. So anything that we can do to reduce the amount of debris that's generated is going to reduce the overall costs for cleaning up that particular disaster or storm. For example, onshore property insured losses caused by Hurricane Michael are estimated at about $8 billion, according to data from Karen Clark and Company. And this doesn't factor in the National Flood Insurance Program claims that would have been generated after that particular storm. So there's also a significant amount of property losses that are happening in addition to the cleanup costs that are associated with a storm management plan. And I think, Darren, you had something to add to this one?
Yeah, so just as a point of reference, we spent about $5 million cleaning up after Hurricane Laura 3 years ago. Um, I suspect that same storm would cost us probably 7 million now. And that's a lot of money. I mean, as we said, we're a small town. That's about 10% of our annual budget. So it would wipe out our entire uh, savings account, so to speak. And if you if you don't plan ahead for these events, you will not be able to gather the information and do all the things that are required for you to get reimbursed from FEMA. Um, they used to be pretty laxed about this, but after Katrina, all that changed. They have very little grace. So just if you've got the money to pay for this yourself, if you can just throw $5 million away, then that's nice. But I don't know many cities or entities that do. So um, the takeaway is it's very expensive, and you better do everything you can to get your reimbursement.
Absolutely. And so, one case example from the city of Columbus, Georgia, by implementing a tree risk management program in Columbus, they did some analysis around response claims, and they decreased between 2001 and 2006 after implementation. And so this led to a measurable reduction in kind of crisis mode management of the urban forest and associated costs. So from their research, tree-related claims were reduced by 72%. Work order complaints and requests for service were reduced by over 55%. And 911 emergency calls and overtime expenditures for cleanup were reduced by over 69%. So here's an example of a city that is able to implement a tree risk management program, and they saw some pretty measurable reductions in costs and response management time for cleaning up that event or any storm related events. So when we talk about storm readiness, there's kind of some core concepts that we really refer to, and there's ways that you can be better prepared for your communities, prepare your community's urban forest for future storms or other events. And some of the top ways that you can be prepared are conducting this tree risk assessment for public trees, but also some of these other topics that we're going to talk about in future webinars, such as developing standing contracts, or sometimes you might have heard them called advanced readiness or pre-contracts. There's a lot of different names for the same thing, but we'll talk about that more in the second webinar. Also developing a debris management plan, which helps you estimate kind of debris amounts and identifies and establishes a debris management site. So where you're taking, especially woody debris, to be processed further before final disposal. And there are certain requirements and qualifications from environmental regulations and laws to making sure that you're being sensitive to cultural resources when you're processing these materials and then finally disposing of them. And then, of course, for storm readiness, you want to be holding some kind of mock annual event so that everybody's on the same page about what's being done during a storm response. Because staff may change, there is staff turnover, it's just a fact of life. And so you want to make sure that everybody is kind of prepared and it's not under a real life scenario. And so they have this practice that's going on. But for today's webinar, again, we're really focusing on this tree risk assessment. And what we mean by a tree risk assessment is it's a specific series of steps and protocols to determine the risk for tree part failures during abnormal conditions. And there's kind of three key variables to assessing tree risk. There's the likelihood of that tree part failing. There's the likelihood of that tree part failing and then impacting a specific target or targets in the nearby vicinity. And then there's the severity of consequences of that failure. So those three things are what an evaluator that's specially trained in tree risk assessment qualification is going to be factoring in when they set a particular risk rating for that tree or that tree part. You want to make sure that you're using an ISA certified arborist that has been specially trained in tree risk assessment qualification. They will have gone through a series of trainings that will allow them to examine a tree through a variety of tests and assessments and assign that risk rating appropriately. There's also different types of tree risk assessment. So there's three main types. There's a limited visual assessment, sometimes known as a windshield or walking survey. You may have also heard of this as called a level 1 tree risk assessment. This is basically a limited view that an individual is taking either by walking or driving slowly by in a car. It is assessing a larger population of trees within a municipality. So say all street trees or all trees that are in parks and open spaces. So you're kind of doing a little bit more of a rapid assessment. You're not getting a full 360-degree view of the tree, hence the terms limited visual assessment. But the purpose of this particular assessment is for you to be able to flag individual or obvious defects or things that you notice during this kind of brief passing by of the tree. And what this allows you to do is flag that individual tree and understand, okay, out of our entire population of trees, these ones have been flagged for further follow-up and for a more intensive assessment process, which is the level 2, or also known as a basic assessment. That basic assessment is a 360-degree view of the tree. So you're doing a much more thorough assessment around the tree. And there's certain basic assessment protocols that you're doing. You're looking at the crown. You're looking at what's going on with the trunk and the limbs. You're also maybe probing into the soil around the root collar to making sure there's any kind of visual or noticeable defects at the surface level of the soil. So you're doing a more thorough assessment. You're making more observations. You're using some basic instruments or tools such as a probe, maybe probing certain holes or decay that might be in the tree. You might be using some binoculars to get a closer examination of the crown or particular limbs that are higher up. But you're not doing more advanced or using more advanced instrumentation to provide more information or context. So after the basic assessment, one outcome of that may be there might need to be an advanced assessment done, or what's known as a level 3. And in the level 3 assessment, you would be bringing in much more specialization measurements or testing that happens. So there might be special instrumentation that's brought in, say, to determine the extent or level of decay that's going on in the tree. You may be taking some soil samples. If you've noticed some kind of symptoms or indications of disease or pests, you may be taking samples and then sending them off to a lab for further diagnostics. And those would really be done on a tree where you need more information to really understand what's going on. You wouldn't be able to understand it fully through the basic assessment. And so you're setting up yourself and doing further testing for that more advanced assessment. The level of assessment really depends on the goals and objectives of your tree risk management program. And all three different types of assessments have value depending on the area of the program. So getting back to the level 1, that's something that you would be doing on a larger population of trees to kind of understand what's the general risk in the entire population. The basic assessment would help you to understand of the trees that were flagged, what are the needs moving forward, what is the risk of those particular individual trees. And then for those hard cases where you may need to do more specific testing, or maybe it's a more valuable tree in your community, say it's a heritage tree or a tree that's very visible or public facing, such as outside of City Hall or maybe the municipal courthouse. You want to be able to take more care because it's a more special tree in the community. You might do further, more advanced assessments for it. And we'll walk you through the kind of the various stages of getting a program started, kind of looking through this lens. Darren, from your experience for tree risk assessment, do you have anything further to add?
So when I started my position 22 years ago, we had no inventory. and we had no inspection protocols. We basically responded to complaints, and if a tree fell, we went and picked it up and hauled it off. And the logic behind that, from a political standpoint, I was told was that we didn't want to go looking for these problems and writing them down and codifying them, because they felt that would increase our liability. But over time, I kind of convinced them that, we're liable for it anyway. If they're our trees, and we're not taking care of them, then we do have some liability there. So now we take a different approach, that as long as we're making a good faith effort to identify problems and mitigate those problems, in a reasonable way, and spending a reasonable amount of money each year doing that, that does buy you an incredible amount of grace. Because, obviously, even if you did an advanced assessment on every tree in your city, you're still going to have issues. Because you can't mitigate every hazard, nor would you necessarily want to. Each city is going to have its own degree of risk threshold that they like, and those may be different in different parts of town, depending on the types of trees, how people view those trees, and all those things. So if you're leery about doing this because of liability issues, again, you're already liable. So make a good faith effort. These windshield surveys are very easy to do. If you have an inventory and you know where your bad trees tend to be, or what species tend to be problematic, you can drive through neighborhoods fairly quickly, and they are incredibly accurate. If you really know your city well, or whatever, whatever unit that you're over, whether it's a park or an entire county, where the problems are. So make a concerted effort, and over time it'll lower your liability.
Absolutely. So as Darren mentioned, if you have an existing public tree inventory, this is a great way to add additional value to that, to understand it. If you don't have existing tree inventory data, then it's a great opportunity to collect this information, and also make sure that when you're contracting out for that tree inventory work, that you request that the assessment be done on the population of trees, so that you can understand what potential risks are within that population. And we'll talk a little bit about, if you don't have a tree inventory or risk assessment, how you can get started a little bit better on that. But identifying and mitigating tree risks of failure can increase public safety and reduce that property damage and overall canopy loss during those storm events. So tips for assessing risk for your community's public trees, include develop a storm team, and we'll talk about this a little bit more detail in the next slide. But identify those tree risk zones. So again, if you know your city's population of trees really well, or the trees in particular neighborhoods, you may already have a good idea or understanding about where these tree risk zones are. But we also have some resources on some models that could potentially help you strategize or prioritize assessing risk in these zones. You want to conduct that level 1 risk assessment in priority zones first. So you want to be able to do that quick, rapid assessment to kind of understand what's going on with the general population of trees. And you want to make sure to hire only arborists with that tree risk assessment qualification. So you want to make sure that the personnel that are making these assessments are appropriately trained. And then once you have that information from the level 1 assessment or that limited visual assessment, then you can start identifying which populations or subsets of trees need that additional level 2 assessment to get a better understanding of what the true risks are for that population of trees. And then you can start integrating that information. So the tree risk assessment assessor is going to not only assess risk, but they're also going to make recommendations on how you could potentially mitigate that risk. And so you can start to integrate that mitigation into your more routine maintenance that you do on your population of trees over time. And you have a better understanding of what's highest risk versus maybe what something is a much lower risk and can be potentially done at a later date since resources are limited. And then, of course, as you're, this is again gets back to that case of making sure that you're still doing that routine maintenance and structural pruning, especially for that structural pruning of newly planted trees, because that is going to help you have a much healthier population of trees, a much healthier urban forest, and you're going to be able to avoid some of these problems that develop over time through either poor pruning practices or just lack of maintenance. That backlog of maintenance is going to lead to further problems such as decay or damage. And then from your experience, Darren, on this, anything further to add?
Yeah, so when we had our last storm, Hurricane Laura, our contractor, debris removal contractor, and our monitor for that contract showed up, and the first thing they asked me, they said, well, like what parts of the city do you think are the worst? Because obviously we want to put resources in that area than we do where there's very little debris on the ground. So they had 50 trucks show up, and we didn't want to put them all in one spot. So we decided to kind of put an equal number of resources in each council district, so that everyone would feel like they were getting cleaned up first, which obviously has some good psychological benefits to it. But we quickly discovered that there were areas where we had a lot more debris, and the way we mapped those out is we just went to the tree inventory, and I turned on a filter that showed where hazard trees had been removed over the last 10 years. And they kind of congregated in certain parts of the city. So we went and did some ground truthing on that in vehicles, and sure enough, there was a lot more damage in those parts of the city than say the subdivisions that were only 10 years old that only had 5-foot tall crepe myrtles and Bradford pears in them. So we wanted to get to the areas that had 100-year-old water oaks and pines and those sorts of things. So even if you don't have a very thorough every tree inventory, or if you haven't assessed all those trees, if you track your removals over time, especially hazard removals, that'll give you a great idea of where to go, not only to look for more hazard trees, but where you're going to have more debris piles after a storm.
Absolutely. So to get started, we start with this storm team, and we say this because this is going to be really a core group of individuals that are going to help you facilitate all of the different components of storm readiness. So not only with the tree risk management program, but also again in future webinars when we discuss standing contracts or developing a debris management plan or a tree recovery plan post-storm event. And so these are going to be individuals that are going to be across multiple departments within a municipality that are going to need to coordinate and collaborate on these resources during a storm response. And so and also not necessarily limited just within the municipality. Say you contract out a lot of your tree services. You want to be able to bring in those contractors to be involved in those discussions. Your utilities are another great outside resource to be bringing in, because they're obviously going to want to be, they're going to be integral in a storm cleanup response. And of course, there's a lot of information sharing that needs to happen with the utilities to get them back up online. And then, of course, your state agency representatives are going to be able to provide a lot of valuable knowledge and resources. So your state emergency management agency, your forestry agency, all of these different state entities have a lot of great knowledge and expertise, and that will really weigh in and be important as you start to do this greater storm planning within your community. Darren, can you speak at all about your storm team in particular?
Yes. So to me, the most important part about this is first, you got to get the right people on the bus. So, anyone who interfaces with a storm response, a cleanup, dealing with trees, whether it's on a normal basis or just very peripherally involved. And you've got to stay in touch with these folks, because if you're an urban forester or a municipal arborist, you're always thinking about, okay, what are we going to do if a storm happens, because that's really your responsibility. But your city engineer is not necessarily thinking about it, or your traffic person, or the girl in accounting, or whoever. So just kind of stay in touch with them. Make sure that if, as we said earlier, staff changes a lot. So make sure you keep this updated. Have a meeting once a year, or maybe have a mock training event, because they're not necessarily thinking about the trees all the time. And the more folks you can have on this, the better.
Exactly. Gets it help to internalize it into a city culture as well, of like, this is something that we regularly do as part of our response and planning efforts, because it is a very complex topic. So you may be wondering, where do we choose to do our inventory, or where do we maybe choose to do our tree risk assessments? So there's a variety of strategies that you can do to identify these places within your community. One is, there is a model that was developed in GIS called the Urban Tree Risk Index. And this is a tool that can help arborists and emergency management personnel identify the areas of greatest need for tree risk assessment. If you have GIS capabilities in your community, this model can be built to rank from low to priority areas for assessing tree risk and maybe establishing routine inspection routes. The tool brings in spatial data sets such as roads, parcels, public facilities, and land cover data to model and determine where the areas of highest risk of tree failure overlaps with prioritized routes such as evacuation routes. Field verification of the data is conducted, and the values are adjusted based on what you experience in on the ground conditions. So there's a link here where you can find instructions to build the GIS model and the different data sources that are necessary to feed into the model to generate these results. And so you can see here that areas in green are, the lowest areas of risk, or the lowest priority for an inspection schedule. Yellow is more of a moderate. Orange is a little bit higher than that. And then, of course, red is the most prioritized areas of the municipality for doing the assessments. And so that can help you narrow down if resources are limited, or you're just trying to get started, you get your feet on the ground around this topic and start a management program, a tree risk management program. It can help you focus your efforts in to the most critical or important efforts first, and then work your way out from there. This is a table that's part of the output of the model. So it tells you kind of different street sections, the inspection schedule, and kind of the level of risk for them. And so once you get your output, then you can start to do your inspection schedule and implement the resource. Now, if you subcontract these services out to a tree care provider or a tree service provider, a tip here is make sure that you contract out these services separately, so that you're contracting out your tree risk assessor separately from a contractor who would actually be doing the mitigation or the pruning work. And this really helps you to reduce conflict of interest in the assessment process, so that you're kind of making sure that there's no issues or problems with that. And so you can see here, it produces out, which trees should be part of an annual inspection versus which trees should be part of assessments every 1 to 2 years, or every 5 to 7, or every up to 5 to 7. There's different types of mitigation. So mitigation can take many different forms. What we think of as limb removal or pruning or crown cleaning, actually removing the tree. But sometimes it can be as simple as moving the target. So if you have removed any targets away from the potential hazards, then you won't necessarily need to do, depending on the hazard itself or the part that's going to fail, you may not necessarily need to do anything at all once you've moved the target. Sometimes it may just be further observation or further assessment. So doing some more detailed assessments, such as sampling or using special instrumentation to understand the problem a little bit better. So it's not always cut and remove as the mitigation measure. Reevaluations are critical to your program's success. So this is not something that's a one and done kind of program. You want to make sure that you're regularly maintaining the data. And preparation and regular inspections are just as vital to storm recovery, and will help you save up to 50% of the cost by performing them outside of a crisis time frame. So doing things in the thick of a response is, things are going to be more expedited, more rushed. Costs can tend to be a little bit higher too, because of the expediency of dealing with the cleanup. So you want to do this in a time where it's not crisis mode, and make sure that you continue to do these inspections over time. The annual limited visual assessments are for the highest risk trees. You want to do those annually. But you also want to do a full limited visual assessment on an entire population of trees after a major storm event. So the major storm event is what we consider kind of a reset event. And so it can dramatically change the level of risk within an individual tree. And so we always recommend that you do that full population reassessment after any kind of major storm event, so that you can kind of understand what is your new level of risk within the overall population. And then this doesn't necessarily have to be, once you kind of have that initial assessment done, this is information that can be integrated as your tree crews are doing routine tree maintenance. So, as they're going out, maybe this tree wasn't identified as a high risk tree in previous assessments, but a crew goes out and they start getting into the crown or the canopy to do some cuts and some general maintenance. And they notice a problem, or they notice something that they consider to be a flagging situation, that can go into maintenance records. And that way, that this is a tree that's now flagged for further assessment by qualified individuals, either on staff or by contractor. So this is a program that you can integrate into your regular tree maintenance program as well. And while costs for inspections are less than creating that baseline tree inventory data, so creating that tree inventory data, if you don't have it to begin with, is a big cost, upfront cost. The inspections are much less, but something to consider is you want to make sure that your annual budgets are adaptive to account for the variability from year to year for particular storm events. So while you may have invested a lot of upfront costs in collecting data and doing a lot of mitigation from the outset, you want to be adaptive to make sure that you can respond effectively in any particular year for a major event that comes along. So just making sure that you're well fiscally resourced to be adaptive to managing risk in the future as well. So I'm going to talk about a case study for the city of Niceville. So let's say you don't have the GIS capacities to be able to do a modeling for determining where high tree risk is. As Darren mentioned a little bit ago, if you know your population of trees really well, there's certain neighborhoods where trees with poor form or known problems, like water oaks, were typically planted historically, and that they're over mature at this point, then you can start to maybe identify on a map just areas of tree risk zones. So you don't need a fancy GIS model to be able to help define these areas for you. You can certainly use your local knowledge of your municipality to start identifying these areas within your community. Just a little background context, Niceville, Florida. It's in the panhandle of Florida. They got a glancing pass from Hurricane Michael. They had some cleanup, but it was not severe. They did not have extensive canopy loss as other communities that got the full brunt of the hurricane. But JIC went down and we helped do some storm preparation, storm planning work with them to help the city be better prepared for the next major storm. And the city had contracted tree maintenance around critical government facilities about 7 years ago, but they lacked a public tree inventory. And so in this map here, all of these little yellow dots are locations of particular trees that JIC staff inventoried to help provide them with a partial tree inventory to get them started to do and think about this storm planning work. So we collected some tree inventory data and we flagged some trees that were in poor conditions for additional risk assessment. And we decided on a particular locations or focused our efforts in this particular zone of the city. And this is the reason why. When you kind of zoom in to a more of a site scale, you start to see that there's a lot of critical resources here located around these facilities. So the city's park and city's police and fleet parked in this back lot where there was a lot of trees. City Hall was located here, the public library, the police station, the fire station. So there's this concentration of critical resources and infrastructure in this one location. And they didn't have good records or data other than that they had done some maintenance 7 years ago on this population of trees. And so tree inventories are a great way to document maintenance needs for specific trees and to help develop a management plan going forward. So the inventory helped flag some trees to potentially do some mitigation around these critical facilities. And so we prioritized this particular area. So we didn't do that GIS model that I mentioned earlier, but we looked at kind of what was practical and most efficient and most needed for Niceville based on kind of what are the conditions going on across the city. So we did a partial inventory. It did not include a limited visual assessment. However, some obvious tree defects were recorded during the tree inventory process. So just to make clear, we did not do a tree risk assessment on their tree inventory, but we did flag some things that we thought were some defects or poor structure or form. So you can see here of the trees that were identified, there were some that we had flagged and recommended that they have someone who is tree risk assessor qualified come out. We didn't have really the scope or capacity to do that with the resources we had at the time, but we recommended that they go and have these trees further looked at by a professional. So these data help support a more targeted assessment of trees that should be examined further for risk. And so we made that recommendation that they should start considering doing that level 1 assessment on certain properties or populations of trees, and then do that more basic or further assessment on trees flagged during that inventory collection. And then this allows the city to potentially mitigate risk in advance of a severe storm. They didn't get hit hard by Michael this last time, but they are in a high risk area on the Gulf for further and more severe storms into the future. And so the more that they can do to be prepared and mitigate that risk, the less damage that they're potentially going to suffer, and the more canopy they can potentially conserve or preserve after a future storm. I also want to take a second and talk a little bit about Urban Forest Strike Team. So this is a team of specially trained arborists, urban foresters, and GIS support that assists communities with tree risk assessment and mitigation in the aftermath of a storm or other natural disaster. If your state has an urban forest strike team, which many of the larger states in the southern region do, they oftentimes will deploy strike team resources to aid cities within their state, but they'll also oftentimes deploy resources to aid other states that maybe have smaller programs or non-existent programs. And you can oftentimes reach out or request these services from your state urban and community forestry coordinator. For South Carolina, they do not have currently an urban forest strike team, but you can reach out to Frances Waite, which is your South Carolina State and Urban Community Forestry Coordinator with the South Carolina Forestry Commission, and she can help you walk through what potential resources are available at the state level to help your community in the aftermath of a potential disaster or storm. But I just wanted to highlight some of the benefits of using an urban forest strike team if these resources are available in your particular state. So they're well-trained experts in tree risk assessment and mitigation. They're also very well trained in FEMA's protocols. So typically urban forest strike teams are deployed in the aftermath of larger disasters, either federally declared disasters or other larger events. And so they're a trained team that's available, boots on the ground, and they're familiar with the FEMA protocols. So you're making sure that the data and the protocols that are being done and collected are in compliance with FEMA standards. They also provide additional resources to a cleanup response. And they generate a tree recovery and mitigation report for the community. And I'll talk about that here right now. So what this is it's a mitigation report. Again, it follows those FEMA protocols. They collect data, they collect GPS points, they take photographs, they record species, they take diameter at breast height of the tree. So they're collecting a lot of the biometric data that would be involved in a tree inventory. They are not inventorying the entire population of trees within your community, but they are collecting information of the trees within public rights of ways and on public properties that have been flagged as needing further investigation. They'll generate a complete report on those trees that they have assessed, and they'll also make recommendations on the types of mitigations that need to be happened. So you'll get a report, but you'll also get all of the GIS data, so those shape files identifying those particular trees and the mitigation measures that are necessary, along with the other biometric information such as species and diameter at breast height. So it's a really great resource to have if it's available, because you are getting some of this data that you would need going forward to develop or implement a tree risk management program for your municipality. I also wanted to highlight some other online resources that are available. So the Southern Group of State Foresters have developed the Community Forestry Academy. There are a series of free training videos, including why a community should plan for storms. You need to create an account, but it's free. There's no cost to this, but you need to register and create an account, and then that makes you available to access all of these free training videos. There's also a series of different links and guides that are made available for developing plans and doing further assessments. And so there's a link here that will link you to this Academy page, and you can access all of these free resources. We also have a forest storm mitigation manual that's been developed. This develops a framework on how you could potentially do more storm planning within your community. So that's storm preparation, storm response, and storm recovery. It gives you a little bit of a framework to work with those different various stakeholders and departments within your municipality to start to do this storm planning work in your community. There's also a lot of great resources such as funding sources available to do some hazard mitigation, and gives you more information around ways that you can incorporate green infrastructure into your community. And then finally, if you go to GIC's website, we have a whole page that's dedicated to storm mitigation planning. There's a variety of free resources here, whether it's brochures on why you should make the case to do standing contracts to your city manager or to the city council, to really cool and interesting case studies, such as the one for the city of Alexandria and what had happened to them when they didn't have pre-contracts versus how their response was much more effective in setting those contracts up, and they were able to clean up much more quickly and get reimbursed more fully by FEMA, as well as some modules that have been developed on these different topics. If you want further information, either reading in advance of the webinars that are coming up or after you have watched the webinars, there's much more details in these modules that we've developed, and they're located on our website as well to learn more information about storm planning. And with that, I'm going to pause here to see if we have any time for Q&A from Karen.
Yes, you definitely have time to do Q&A. So about 5 minutes. Some folks had posted questions in the panel. One was, Darren, how do you inventory trees on adjacent private property but within a zone of influence to public roadways, to use city resources to reduce hazards from private property trees. And Darren noted, we notify property owners if they have a tree that's an imminent threat to things or people in the public right of way. So far, that was the only question that I had that was of substance. If anyone else would like to type a question in the question panel, we can read those aloud. Also, if you would prefer to have us answer your question live, you can simply raise your hand and we can call on you. So if anyone has any questions, again, type them in the question pane. Darren and Matt can answer them there and also say them aloud. But if you also want us to recognize you, we'd be happy to do that as well.
And just to further clarify on that last point,
Yeah.
So we don't go like looking around in people's yards for issues, but if we become aware or made aware of a tree that is very close to the right of way that's going to fall and damage our utilities or fall across the sidewalk or street, then we notify the property owners with a letter, and we give them a certain amount of time to mitigate the hazard. And then if they don't, and we feel like it's a big enough threat, we will use city funds to go and remove that hazard, because we feel like it's cheaper for us to do that than to try to go out there at 3 o'clock in the morning and clean it up, because that's typically when they fall.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes the community's codes and ordinances will give the city or the municipality authority to deal with nuisance or hazardous trees that are going to potentially jeopardize public property within that envelope that individual mentioned. I also want to mention there's contact information down here for Kara, myself, Francis Waite with the South Carolina Forestry Commission, as well as Darren. If you think of something after the webinar, a question or a comment, please reach out to us on that. And before we lose time on this as well, I just want to highlight here about how people can receive their ISA credits for attending this webinar or for the certification maintenance credits. So to receive ISA credits for the webinar, please email me, Matthew Lee, at mlee@gicinc.org, your full name and your ISA number. We will take that information, we'll cross-check it with the attendance logs for the webinar to make sure, and then submit that information on behalf of you to ISA to receive credit. So as long as you email me your first and last name along with your ISA number, and you attended the full webinar, we will make sure that that information gets submitted. To receive certification maintenance credits by the American Planning Association and the South Carolina Planning Education Advisory Committee, send me your full name, first and last, to my email, specifying that you want those planning credits, and we will send back a signed certificate that you completed the webinar. And that will be the documentation you need to make sure that you receive those credits.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're just about out of time. So I'd really like to thank our speakers today for providing time, especially to Darren Green, who volunteered to provide his time taken away from his busy city schedule. And we do hope that others of you will attend the upcoming 3 webinars. We'll certainly send everyone a reminder to register for those. And with that, it seems like, oh, yes, we had a thank you. Lots of great information. I saw one last question, so it was just a thank you, and appreciate that, Horace. And we will send everyone a copy of the slides, and we will also send you a copy of the recording to listen to at your leisure. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day and stay safe out there. Bye-bye.